Some memories don't weaken with time. They thicken, like the dust you find under old stairs, heavy, stubborn, and strangely warm when you breathe it in. I used to think the past stayed where we left it, that if you sealed a door, or painted over a seam, or put something in a box and pressed the lid, the future would respect your effort. But houses have their own metabolism. They exhale in winter and inhale in summer. They push up smells you don't have names for, and every so often they return what somebody hid, quietly, like setting a glass down on a nightstand. Tonight, I want to tell you about 3 things that never should have come back. They weren't heirlooms. No one wrapped them to be found by grandkids on a sunny day. These weren't time capsules the way schools do them, with newspapers and a list of prices and a letter about the year 1995. These were household edits, small attempts to tuck away something too alive to throw out. They were sealed behind walls, under stairs, inside a trunk that should have rotted out. They came back anyway, as if the house had been instructed to remember for someone who couldn't. You'll hear the strange part, you'll feel the soft punch of it. But what lingered for me wasn't the fear, it was the quiet afterward, the way the air changes when you know a door can open by itself. A red string under a seam you were sure was solid, a jar that fogs from the inside with no hand on the glass, a trunk that smells like the lake in January even when the laundry's going and the furnace is red hot. I won't promise answers. Some things get sealed because they won't stop moving in the dark, and even when you find them, they keep the rhythm they chose. Story 1. My name is Aaron M. I'm 38, a licensed home inspector out of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'm the kind of guy people hire when they don't want surprises. I check the roof line, the wiring, the crawl space, the slope away from the foundation. I carry a moisture meter that chirps like a polite bird, a thermal camera, a flashlight with a side flood, and a mug I never wash properly because the coffee tastes better when the rim smells like work. Late October 2016, the week of the first frost. A Tuesday. I had one last inspection on a 1910 American Foursquare, vacant, near a rail spur where the trains pass slow at night. The listing called it Original Features Intact, which always means complicated plumbing and wallpaper you can smell. I was alone, which I prefer for basements. No one saying, "Is that bad?" every time the beam ticks. The house had that dry cellar breath to it, chalk dust with a coal aftertaste. I did my usual circuit, stairs, joists, efflorescence on the walls. The pull chain bulb above me was the older kind with the glass faintly amber. When they hum, the sound sits just behind your teeth. Down a short hallway, tucked behind a half wall of stacked concrete, I found the coal room. A little square of a space with an old chute sealed from the outside. Except the seal was wrong. The mortar smear around the door jamb was a pale, fresh gray against the dull, original stuff. Whoever had skimmed it hadn't bothered to match the texture. And poking from the base seam, right where the floor met the jamb, was a single red string, tight as a vein, heading under the skim and into the room you weren't supposed to enter. If you do this job long enough, you learn not to touch what you can document. I took photos, then a little video. The moisture meter clicked once, then stopped, then clicked again, evenly spaced, 2 seconds apart, like a slow metronome. The air wasn't moving, but the pull chain swayed, nicking the bulb with a soft, rhythmical tick that made my tongue taste like pennies. Through the foundation window, a neighbor's voice drifted up. An older guy, breath white in the cold dusk. "Power's off," he said like a comment, not a warning. "Been off. House was shut in '89. They didn't pay the bills after she died." I looked up at the humming bulb. "Maybe the line's live to the fixture," I called back, which is nonsense but something to say. The bulb buzzed deeper, a low animal note, and the red string tugged once. So slight I could have convinced myself it was the furnace cycling if the furnace hadn't been stone dead. You can walk away from a lot in this job, but a seam you can thumb open is irresistible. I took my multi-tool and chipped the new skim. It failed the way fresh work fails. Too clean. Under the skim, the old hinges showed. The door itself was sunken just an inch, enough to catch on the concrete. I pried a little, careful not to collapse the frame, and the coal room breathed out a pocket of cold that smelled like a handful of nails. Inside, against the far wall, sat a cigar box wrapped in wax paper. The red string ran from under the door, around the box twice, and back to a spool inside, like someone had cinched it and then tucked the free end away. The dust on the floor had those strange vertical patterns dust shouldn't have, like it had been drizzling down in pulses. I should have left it. I know, I'm not paid to open time. But I was alone in a house with a red string tied to a box, and I could already hear the questions a buyer would ask later. I lifted the box. It weighed almost nothing, the way old paper does. The wax crackled when I peeled it back. Inside, a scuffed child's Oxford shoe with a leather toe cap. A brass hotel key fob stamped with the name of a place we tore down years ago downtown. The Montrose. A box of a hotel with red carpeting and a blue sign I remember from winter nights. A spool of red thread, almost new. And a folded grocery receipt, crisp, with a date at the top. October 29th, 2016. The coming Saturday. On the back, in pencil, were my initials, AM. The letters leaned left, the way I used to write when I was trying to copy my dad's script. I haven't written like that since high school. Every hair on my arms went cold. I turned the receipt over and read the items. A jug of milk, sandpaper grit 120, plumber's putty, and a single bolt. Nothing that should have made me feel watched, but there it was. You can talk yourself down from a lot. I told myself, out loud, that the initials could be anyone, that dates get mangled by cashiers, that a hotel key fob is the sort of antique people keep in boxes because it feels grown up. I wrapped the box again, set it back, and eased out of the coal room. I pulled the door tight. The pull chain had nearly stopped its sway. The moisture meter chirped once, like a for-the-record note. When I bent to collect my tool bag, I found the red string tied around its handle. Clove hitch, not a novice knot. The string was the same diameter as the one from under the door, with that slight wax polish you feel when you pinch it. I do not tie clove hitches on my bag. I didn't touch it, just lifted the handle and let the knot ride. I forced myself to finish the checklist. GFC is outlet snaking from knob and tube. Stair treads a hair shallow for code. I wrote a bland report. Recommend qualified electrician. Monitor efflorescence. I locked up. On my way out, I walked past the neighbor at the fence. He studied my bag, the red around the handle. He didn't ask. He said, "We used to hear a little bell at night, like a light chain. Maybe a train car." I drove home with the windows cracked, even though the cold burned my gums. My apartment is a second-floor walk-up with a utility closet in the hall. There's a cold water pipe in there I've banged my head on enough times to hate it. I keep the door closed. That night, I opened it to get a trash bag, and a length of red string hung from that pipe at chest height, tied in a clove hitch, the tag end just long enough to touch my shirt. I didn't touch it. I closed the door. I slept with the bathroom light on because it has a fan that hums over the thin private sounds you can hear when a building is very still. I did another inspection the next day and the day after. The report from the Foursquare went out. I never mentioned the coal room to the buyer. I told myself it wasn't a defect, just a curiosity. Saturday rolled around, October 29th, and I bought milk and plumber's putty and a pack of sandpaper without meaning to. At the hardware store, I set a single bolt on the counter and asked for a receipt before the cashier had even hit the total. My initials leaned left when I signed. Watching my hand, I felt the small, precise horror of recognition. I don't go back to that house. I can't tell you what the coal room looks like now. I can tell you the red knot around my utility pipe is still there. It collects the kind of dust that doesn't drift. It lands in dots. If I ever go down twice, I guess I'll know why the message was written in a hand I gave up. Since then, the silence under pull-chain bulbs bothers me more than any scream. Between stories, I think about how easily we make little shrines without meaning to. A knot in a string. A box with a shoe we can't throw away. A receipt we sign with an old version of ourselves. We tell a house, "Hold this for me," and sometimes the house says, "I did." Story 2. If I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't believe a kitchen could have a voice. My name is Linda Reyes. I'm 45, a high school counselor in Oak Park, Illinois, and for most of my adult life I kept the lights low when the furnace cycled, because the sound of that start-stop made me think of airplanes failing to lift. In January 2021, I inherited a 1920s bungalow from my aunt, who collected recipe cards and plastic grocery bags and had a way of hiding money in the most exhausting places. I planned to renovate the kitchen in spring. Until then, I was making lists. Outlets, cabinets, whether I could widen the pantry without cutting into load-bearing. I wrote by hand because typing made me feel less like I owned anything I was saying. It was past 11 on a Tuesday. The temperature was in the single digits, the kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose feel like glass. My daughter was asleep down the hall, mouth open, breathing the slow, even way you can hear from another room. The furnace was short-cycling, kicking on, giving up, kicking on again. I told myself I'd call the tech in the morning. In the pantry, there was a square of wall that didn't match. The plaster was too smooth, a little newer, a little whiter, like a patch someone intended to paint later and never did. The original plan for the house had a dumbwaiter. My aunt said it had been sealed before she bought the place. I pressed my fingernail into the seam. The plaster flaked under a gentle push, like a scab that was ready. Behind the patch was a shallow cavity no deeper than my arm. The back was lined with old shelves, stained the color of weak tea, and on those shelves, lined up like they were still doing a job, sat 12 mason jars sealed with wax. The lids were old, the kind with faded fruit prints. Each jar had a label in ballpoint or fountain pen or pencil, a dozen different hands, all addressed to L, not Linda, just L. My name is not unusual. Still, I felt that little interior click you get when a coincidence lands just right. I pulled a jar. The wax creased under my thumb as if it had been waiting for my warmth. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a house key on a plain brass ring. I walked the bungalow trying the key in every lock, front, back, garage, basement, even the shed door. It fit nothing. I put it back in the jar because that seemed like a promise I wasn't ready to break. Another jar held a recipe card, my mother's handwriting exactly. Chicken soup with too much dill, the one she made when someone was sick. The paper was new, not yellowed like old recipe cards, the ink still dark. I ran my finger over the letters and felt the indentations like she'd written it a minute ago with a heavy hand. When I breathed on the glass, a fog formed from the inside, not the outside. It blossomed, then receded, leaving clean glass like a wiped window. There was a jar with a photograph, a little girl on a gym stage in a handmade cotton costume with a cardboard crown. 2008, if the date in the corner was honest. From across the room, she looked exactly like my daughter. Same narrow shoulders, the anxious way she held her elbows. But the banner at the back of the stage had a school name from across town, a place we'd never set foot in. I held the photo at arm's length and felt the practical part of me fizz under my skin, the way it does when all your careful boxes collapse at once. In a jar near the back, wrapped in old Christmas napkin paper, I found a cassette tape labeled in blue ballpoint. Linda, 1998, read on a good day. I was 22 in 1998. I had no cassette deck. My aunt kept everything, so I checked the low pantry cabinet where she used to stash rinse jars. On the bottom shelf was a little tape recorder with pastel stickers on the back. I blew dust off the speaker and fed the cassette in. The player clicked like it was glad to have work again. The voice on the tape was mine, younger, too quick, breathless the way I used to get when I wanted to outrun how I felt. I was reciting, a list of apologies to a child named L, not future tense, present. I'm sorry I didn't listen when you said the hall smelled wrong. I'm sorry I turned the radio up instead of opening the window. I'm sorry I tried to explain the ache like it was weather. The words were too exact. They weren't memories. They were sentences I'd written in my notebook that week, whole phrases, down to the way I crossed out and rephrased ache as weight. I looked at the page, then at the tape, and felt the cold ride up my arms from the pencil into my shoulders. I stopped the tape. The pantry felt warmer than the rest of the kitchen. A smell crept out of the cavity, camphor and wintergreen, the quiet, medicinal scent of a closed bathroom cabinet. The old call button to the left of the pantry, a brass disc that goes nowhere because the intercom was removed 10 years ago, ticked once, then twice, like a metal throat clearing. I told myself the furnace was throwing interference. I told myself to close the wall up and hire someone licensed. Then, above me, the dumbwaiter door on the second floor slid open with a wooden sigh. Not fast, just enough to let its own weight decide the distance. I stood in the pantry and stared at the ceiling, heart in my neck, waiting for my daughter to stir or call my name. The house went very quiet. The furnace paused between cycles, and suddenly you could hear the tiny sounds a kitchen bears, glass settling, a drip inside a pipe, the small rub of a bulb filament. I climbed the stairs and felt the temperature drop 2 degrees with each step. The dumbwaiter door at the top landing stood half open. The shaft behind it was clean wood, sanded but unfinished, as if closed up mid-project. On the little platform sat one more jar, unlabeled. The wax seal was neat, almost proud. Inside was a paper wristband from Urgent Care, March 2021, 2 months away from the night I was holding it. My name on the band. Reason code. Observation. My daughter coughed once in her sleep, that dry winter cough, then turned over and went still. I carried the jar back down like it might spill if I didn't keep it level. I lined the jars on the counter, one by one, my breath shallow, because my chest had found a new way to be small. I stared at the unlabeled one until the word observation blurred into the paper texture. I don't know how to describe the thought that followed except to say it wasn't mine, but it wore my voice. It said, "Put the jars back the way you found them, and don't read the rest unless you want to be responsible for them." I'm a mother, which means I know about responsibility you don't get to decline. I resealed the cavity with painter's tape and cardboard, a temporary boundary that fooled no one. I put the cassette on top of the fridge. I told myself I'd call a professional in the morning. In the morning, the furnace behaved perfectly. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the dryer sheet I'd tucked in the trash because sometimes that helps when you're living in someone else's house. I drove my daughter to school. On the way back, I passed the other school, the one from the photo, because the route put me there. I told myself I was taking the scenic way home to see the old trees by the park. I didn't tell myself I was hoping to catch the gym door open. I found the odd house key again that afternoon in the cup holder of my car. I do not put keys there. The metal was so cold it hurt my palm. When I held it up to the sunlight and turned it, a faint fog formed on my fingers, not on the key, like I was the surface being warmed and cooled too fast. I slid the key into my pocket because carrying it felt like admitting my place in something I couldn't yet name. I've driven past that other school a dozen times since January. I don't know what I'm expecting. The banner from the photo, a janitor with a box of old costumes, a lost and found bin with a paper crown. I tell myself I'm keeping an eye on the future the jars tried to hand me gently. I don't play the cassette anymore. But sometimes the pantry call button ticks twice, and the jar without a label fogs from the inside when the house is very quiet. I retape the patch and wipe my fingerprints away and convince myself I haven't started talking to the walls. The truth is simpler and stranger. The kitchen has a voice now, and it speaks in the exact apologies I owe. You learn a house by its rhythms. The first few nights I slept on a cot upstairs. The sump kicked on with a dependable clunk, ran, shut off. The furnace sighed. The wind found a loose siding and made it complain in a single note 2 floors higher. I mapped where the cold pushed in and where the heat sat. I taped a carpenter's pencil under the breaker panel for notes, dates, noises, fixes. Control is a kind of prayer if you do it long enough. Behind the washer in the basement, there was a wall someone had skinned in tar paper. Not a repair, more like a quick cover. The paper was stapled into furring strips that didn't line up with anything structural. The staples were newer than the wood, a bright zinc that caught my light. On the paper, about waist high, someone had chalked a pale blue line that went across the whole length, dead level, beautifully straight, and next to it, in the same pale chalk, the number 76. The chalk looked too bright for a 40-year-old mark. I touched it, and it dusted my fingertip, fresh as if it had been laid down last week. When you work around water, you get good at reading stains. A flood line is usually dirty, an honest mark of where the silt decided to stop. This was different. The chalk didn't describe an event, it declared a limit. I could have ignored it. Except limits are where you find problems. I pulled the washer out, cut the tar paper with a utility knife, and peeled it like skin. Behind it was a shallow cavity boxed out by old boards. In that cavity sat a steamer trunk with buckled leather straps, the kind they show in movies when a ship lists. The trunk was the color of dried coffee. Around its middle, the same pale chalk line circled like a belt, with 76 marked neat at the latch. I put both hands on the trunk and felt cold through the leather, as if it had been stored in ice water. Water had no business being that cold down there. The room was a steady 55 degrees. I listened and heard the sump cycle off. The quiet that followed had a weight to it. If you've ever run a shop alone at night, you know the feel. A stop so complete you hear your mouth open. Then, faint and private, came another sound, a little wooden ticking, dry and sure, not the drip of water and not the tick of metal contracting. I've spent my life with gears and tolerances. I can tell you the sound came from inside the trunk. I cut the straps. The leather fought me, then gave with the soft rip of something that knows it isn't going back together. The lid stuck and then popped, letting out a breath of air so cold it stung my eyes. Inside, under a wool blanket that smelled like the inside of a drawer, was a World War II field jacket folded tight, a ledger bound in cardboard, a little wooden metronome with a brass pendulum, and a handful of other domestic debris, letters rubber-banded together, a cracked porcelain drawer pull, a Boy Scout neckerchief slide. The metronome was the thing ticking, pendulum swinging in a polite arc on its own. I put my finger against the wood and felt each click in my nail. It ticked exactly 62 times and stopped, pendulum resting near center like it had decided. I lifted the jacket. When I ran my thumb under the dog tags, the chain left a damp track on my skin. The tags were stamped with my father's name and correct birth year. He told me his whole life he was 4F for a bad heart and never served. I closed my eyes because there's a specific kind of vertigo when the world insists you misremembered something you lived through. I've got his penknife. I remember the notch from the time he slipped sharpening it at the sink. I remember him swearing at the television during the news and saying, with a mouthful of North Coast vowels, that he'd have gone if Uncle Sam wanted him. The tags in my hand were too cold to be a prank pulled decades ago. They had the taste of iron on them when I did the stupid thing and touched them to my tongue to prove the cold was in the metal, not my head. The ledger made a tired cardboard crack when I opened it. Pencil entries, neat, dated 1955 and 1956. Loan to earn, 50 cents. Loan to earn, 25 cents for pop. To earn, $1 for ball. The address inked on the first page matched my house. I sat on the cool floor and braced the book on my knee, because my hands had learned my father's name on dog tags, and my brain was still scrambling. I was a kid in the mid-50s, only in the math that happens when you put fiction next to family birthdays. My life doesn't fit those dates. The entries were made by someone who kept accounts you can trust. Whoever wrote them expected to be believed. The photograph lay under the ledger, black and white glossy, the kind a corner drugstore used to print. A boy stood in front of a basement wall with a pale line running behind him at waist level. He was 7 maybe, with a stubborn set to his mouth that looks like mine in every school picture I ever hated. He held something in his palm like an offering. I brought the photo close and saw it was the same metronome, fingers curled under to show he wasn't afraid to drop it. The boy's shirt had a little frayed cuff thread sticking out. My wife used to clip those off me without saying anything. My throat made a sound that wasn't for words. You can say this is grief talking or a brain trying to put the lid back on the jar of the world, and I won't argue. I'm a machinist. Machines tell the truth if you give them the right conditions. The truth of the next week was a pattern no one asked me to approve. The sump kept cycling, but not like before. There was a hitch in it that put the run just off where the metronome would have ticked if it had kept going. The metronome, when I set it and wound it, ticked 62 and stopped every time, no matter where I set the weight. 62 I timed it with a shop stopwatch because I didn't trust my own counting. The stopwatch read the same number of seconds each time. There's comfort in an error that repeats. There's dread, too. A neighbor came over with a packet of photocopied articles about the big water in '76. He said he kept them for the new folks so they wouldn't get cocky with their sump pumps. Basement kept listening, he said, not like this was odd. Man before you used to sit down there at night. Said he'd know the hour by the click. He didn't mean a clock. He meant something that had to be watched to stay obedient. The lake came in the house without getting the floor wet. You know that smell, mineral and faint fish, the metallic sweetness of cold water, finding its way into the ductwork and sitting there like an uninvited guest. I checked and rechecked every joint. I wrapped mastic where the return leaked. The smell used the vents anyway. On the 4th night, I marked the high water line on the trunk with my thumbnail, just to prove the chalk wasn't changing. The next morning, there was a thin ring of water beating right against the chalk, as if the trunk pulled moisture from the air and condensed it exactly there, and nowhere else. I wiped it with my sleeve. It formed again. Perfect, fine drops you could count. Grief is a keen tool until it dulls. I used it to cut excuses. I told myself I'd faced real emergencies with noise and electricity and heat. A ticking wooden toy didn't earn my panic. That held until the sleet storm. Midnight, and the windows had that blue look they get when the world outside turns glass. The sump ran like a champion. Then came the wrong drip. If you've ever had a roof leak, you know the dread of the wrong drip, the one that doesn't line up with any pipe. It sounded like a slow finger tapping the hollow part of a desk. I went down. The air reached up and closed around my throat, cold in a way I remember from the walk across the hospital parking lot the night my wife died, the kind of cold that enters your bones by arrangement. The metronome was on top of the trunk where I hadn't left it. I had placed it on a shelf after proving it to myself 10 times. Now it stood on the trunk, pendulum already swinging. No one was in the house but me. It ticked with a dry little certainty that made the hair on my forearms lie down flat. 62 ticks. I counted, hands flat to keep them from pressing my ears. At the 62nd tick, there was a breath where the sump should have grabbed. Not a delay, an absence. In that absence, I heard a boy humming the pitch the metronome makes when it's new and proud. It's a tuning fork kind of hum that sits behind your teeth. The tune was simple, like a march kids make up on a playground. I knew it, not from the radio, not from church, from somewhere with a blue chalk line. The humming passed through the house soft as a boat wake. I set the metronome on its side. It kept ticking 3 more beats before stopping, like it had ideas of its own. I unplugged the sump and plugged it back in because that's what you do when something small tries to create a ritual in your home. You break it on purpose. The pump took its breath and got back to work. I sat on the bottom stair and felt my face with both hands, like a man who can't decide what life he's in. Practicality returned like a coat you can finally get your arms into. I took photos. I taped a square of paper to the trunk where the chalk line wrapped and penciled a date. I placed the metronome in a box with a lid and set a coffee can on top for weight. I got out a shop light and flooded the trunk so there were no friendly shadows. I wished the ceiling higher so I could hang something solid over the trunk and say, "Go ahead. Move now." It felt childish and necessary in equal measure. The next morning, the pencil date on the tape had smudged without fingers touching it, like someone breathed hard on it from close. There was a little pile of pale dust on the floor where there hadn't been any. Chalk dust is its own kind of honesty. It has a way of clinging to the damp part of your fingerprints and staying there after you wash your hands, the lines glowing faint in the cracks of your skin. I scrubbed. The dust found the places the brush didn't. I asked the neighbor about the folks before me. He said the wife left first. The husband kept the basement like a chapel. Said he had to listen. Said if he didn't listen, it got ahead of him. I believed him without wanting to. I started taking my coffee down there in the morning and timing the metronome, like a man who sits with a dog that refuses to die. One evening, my buddy Ray came by with a new shut-off valve for the sillcock. He found me on the bottom stair with my elbows on my knees, looking at nothing. He's known me 40 years. He said, "Ern, if you're going to live in the past, at least pick a part where there's daylight." He spotted the trunk and whistled like a man who's found coin. "That's a beauty. What's inside? Old Sears catalogs?" He reached for the latch. I said, "Wait," in a voice I've only used when a press break has someone's sleeve. He waited. "He's a good man." I said, "Picture and a jacket." I did not say dog tags. I did not say my father's heart or my own. He took his hand back and wiped it on his jeans like he'd touched fog. The storm broke the next night and then backed up on itself. I woke at 1 in the morning with the sense that something had ended. The house was so quiet I could hear my own swallow. The sump took its breath and didn't come back in. The metronome was ticking inside its box. That sound, the click traveling through cardboard, sounded like someone tapping on a coffin to be polite. I lifted the lid and the pendulum kept going without any swing left to live on. I told the machine it was done. I said it aloud. I set my hand over the top to stop the air. It ticked twice through my palm and then rested, balanced at center as if the rule of the world held again. In the minute of quiet that followed, I heard the humming again, closer, barely more than a mouth tone. I stood very still, and it seemed to come from the wall where the chalk line had been drawn. I could picture a kid with his shoulder to the stone, matching the pump, keeping count while the grown-ups worried themselves dry. I had the idiotic urge to hum back, the way you answer a bird without insulting it. I didn't. I stood like my own shadow and let the feeling pass. When the sump grabbed on again, I tensed as if someone had thrown a punch and found myself smiling, which is the kind of laugh machine men make when nothing broke. In the morning, the photo was gone from the trunk. I lifted the wool blanket and ran my hand along the seam of the lining. Nothing. I thought of Ray. I thought of the neighbor. I thought of myself sleepwalking, because there are explanations that don't make you a liar to your own heart. Then I saw the corner of glossy paper under the workbench, a torn piece, blue line across it, and the boy's hand with 3 fingers splayed like he was showing a trick. I kept that corner under the magnet on the breaker panel and told myself I'd stop treating it like a shrine. Rain in the forecast bothers me now. It's not the events, it's the counting. I count to 62 without meaning to when the sump takes a breath, when the microwave stalls at the last second, when the turn signal fails to click off by itself. I wear the dog tags in my pocket some days just so the metal sits heavy and honest. I'm not looking for anyone to explain my father to me. He raised me, and that's enough. The boy in the photo is a problem I can live with. I don't look for him. I don't ask if the house kept listening before I did. I drag my pencil along the edge of my hand, and if the chalk is still there, faint in my skin's fault lines, I wash my hands again, slower like you would before touching a newborn. On quiet nights when the lake air comes cold through the vents, I sit on the bottom stair with my coffee cooling, and I know, in a way I did not make up, that something in this house learned a beat and decided not to let it go. I still catch myself counting to 62 in the dark, even after the room goes perfectly still. There's a moment after any story like this where your house sounds louder than it did an hour ago. You hear the bulb's coil relax, the refrigerator door's rubber gasket unstick itself, the duct tap once. Maybe you reach for a switch to break the quiet. Maybe you lean on the counter and let the room breathe around you because the air belongs to you as much as you belong to it. I don't know how to instruct you out of the feeling that someone set something aside for you to find later. I can tell you it doesn't always mean harm. It means a hand wanted help. It means a memory couldn't hold its shape without a wall to press against. We put things in jars and call them recipes. We write our initials on a receipt we haven't signed yet and feel the tug of an old knot around our hand. We cut tar paper and meet a number we weren't there to earn. We are always editing the house, sandpaper and putty and fresh mortar and paint, and the house is always editing us back, insisting we keep a rhythm we didn't start. If there's a rule, it's this: listen before you decide what you heard. A pull chain can sound like a bell. A tick can be a heart trying to count itself. A cold key can be a map when no door is willing to be found. I keep thinking about what we seal and what we mean by sealing. The aunt who hid jars as a way of speaking to a future version of her niece, the one who would finally hear the apology. The inspector who saw his own handwriting a few days early and didn't quit his job because quitting would mean the house wins. The widower who learned to sit in a basement without demanding an answer from a piece of wood and a length of pipe. None of those are hauntings the way the movies mean. They're the kind that bend the air but don't break it. They're the kind that make you use a softer voice even when you're alone. Maybe all we did was give our houses too many jobs. We asked them to keep the rain out, yes, but also to hold our edits and our secrets and our shortcuts, and to keep them in a climate-controlled place where they wouldn't spoil. We said, "Keep this for me." And the house said, "Fine, but I am not a grave." And so it sends things back on quiet nights, not to punish you, but to make sure nothing gets truly lost. I won't tell you to go down there tonight and look behind your own patch of neat plaster. I won't tell you to pull on any red string or uncap any jar. I will tell you to pay attention to how long the quiet lasts after the furnace stops, and how your fingers remember certain knots without being taught, and how a glass fogs from the inside when you don't expect it. The past does not stay put, and it does not disappear. It circulates, like air through a duct, like water through a pump, like a hum through the bones of a table.